What does Jesus say when he dies? In Mark and Matthew, he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Again, by the way, distancing himself from God and appearing to present himself as a separate being. In Luke, he quotes a different psalm saying, into your hands I commend my spirit. In John, he simply says, it is finished. Reconcilable perhaps, but is it a coincidence that the earlier the gospel, the more Jesus separates himself from God? Not to mention the general increasing divinity of Jesus in later and later gospels, telling me that the historical Jesus didn't even claim to be God in the first place.
Last week there was a debate featuring Alex O'Connor in which he suggested that the earlier the gospel, the less divine Jesus seems to be, and it leaves him with the impression that Jesus never claimed to be divine. It brought to my mind a simple walk through the chapters of the Gospel of Mark that Mike Licona often does, and I think it takes a lot of the force out of Alex's point. So I'm just going to play that for you now.
Mark chapter 1. It opens by saying, as Isaiah the prophet said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight the paths of our God. And notice he's not talking about Jesus coming to do that for God. He goes on in that chapter 1 to talk about John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. Mark chapter 1 pretty much opens up and saying, hey, John the Baptist is coming to prepare the way for God, Jesus. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, Jesus forgives the sins of a paralytic and then heals him. And the Jewish leaders say, you can't forgive sins. Only God can do that. That's blasphemy for you to say that. Only God can forgive sins. And Jesus said, yep. Chapter 3. The Jewish leaders accuse Jesus when he's exorcising demons. They say, you're Satan casting out Satan. And Jesus says, he gives this little parable and he says, hey, if you want to go in, there's a strong man and you want to go in and rob his house, you can't do it unless you first bind the strong man and then you can go into his house and plunder his goods. And Jesus by that is saying, guess what? The strong man is Satan. And when you see me expelling demons and doing exorcisms, that shows I'm only able to do that because I have bound Satan and now I'm plundering his kingdom. People who are enslaved by Satan, I'm setting them free. And I can only do that because I've bound Satan. What human can bind Satan? Chapter 4. Jesus is on the boat and he's asleep. And the boat's getting ready to go under and the disciples wake him up. And he goes up and he speaks and the winds and the waves calm. Well, according to Psalm 89, Psalm 107, and Ecclesiastes 8, calming the wind is something God does. Chapter 5. Jesus raises someone from the dead, which, according to Ecclesiastes 8, only God can raise someone from the dead. They say, wait a minute, Peter raised someone from the dead. Paul raised someone from the dead. What about Elijah and Elisha? They raised someone from the dead. Yep, all these raised people from the dead, but they did so by praying, and they did it in the name of Christ, appealing to God. Jesus did it on his own power and his own word. Mark 6, Jesus walks on water. According to Job chapter 9, verse 8, only God walks on water. Mark chapter 9, Jesus cast out a demon after he comes down from the transfiguration, comes down from the mountain, and his disciples are unable to cast out a demon. He does it. Later on, his disciples say, why couldn't we do that? And he says, well, fellas, this kind only comes out by praying to God. And I could see Peter talking to Philip and saying, he didn't pray. Mark chapters 12, 13, and 14. Jesus makes statements that he's not only David's son, but he's also David's Lord. Mark chapter 14. 12, 13, 14, Jesus is the apocalyptic Son of Man who will be worshipped and served in a manner that should only be given to God. So the whole Gospel of Mark, from its very beginning and all throughout, is very, very clearly telling us about Jesus' character, who he is. Remember, the painter is trying to communicate that to us through the smile and through the eyes. Whereas Plutarch says the biographer is trying to communicate through what the person says and what the person does or did. What did Jesus say and do in the Gospel of Mark? By his very words and deeds, he's claiming to be God. Remember, in the Gospel of John, they said, hey, if you are the Messiah, tell us plainly. And Jesus said, I have told you. The works that I do, they testify who I am.